Earl Morrall was drafted 2nd overall in the 1956 draft, yet after starting only 4 games in his rookie year, was traded. That would mark the start of a 21-year career playing for 6 different teams. But Earl Morrall wasn't like any other backup. He's a man who led 2 different teams to a Super Bowl, won MVP, and a whole lot more. So how did he end up as a career backup? What you saying, guys? It's Zane here. Let's get into it. Earl Morrall barely got a chance any place he landed. Part of that was who he had the misfortune of sharing a roster with: Y.A. Tittle, Fran Tarkenton, Johnny Unitas, and Bob Greasy, all Hall of Famers. But when his number was called, he stepped up and was better than most. Take a look at his numbers compared to his peers when he got at least 9 starts, a relatively low interception percentage, a decent amount of yards, and quite a few wins. Aside from Johnny Unitas, Morrall's numbers held up very well for his era. It really makes you think how his career would have panned out if he only got a proper shot. Up until 1968, so 11 years of being in the league, he started 10 or more games only 3 of 12 seasons. After being drafted by the 49ers 2nd overall, they traded him at the end of the season. His stats weren't great, but we're talking about 4 games. People complain about how rookies don't get enough time to develop in today's league, while Morrall couldn't get any less time to develop. Now the 49ers did have Y.A. Tittle, but he'd been there since 1951. Tittle had just led the league in touchdown passes and made 2 Pro Bowls as a starter, so why draft Morrall? Well, this would become a reoccurring theme. Because of who he backed up, he didn't get much playing time. He was traded to the Steelers for 2 first-round picks, and initially got significant playing time, going 6-5 as a starter and getting a Pro Bowl nod. Bear in mind, the Steelers just gave up 2 first-rounders for Morrall, but despite the high cost, he was traded to the Lions 1 year later in exchange for Bobby Lane. Let's play a game this video. Take a shot every time Morrall crosses paths with a Hall of Famer. He ended up staying in Detroit for a while, at least for Morrall, 6 whole years, but he didn't get a consistent chance to start. It was 5 years before he got at least 10 starts, despite being the best quarterback on the team. Although the Lions weren't great, he did put up great numbers in 1963 when he got a shot. He threw for over 2,600 yards and 24 touchdowns. Now just as things were looking good, he got injured, back to the bench. He was then shipped to the Giants, where he would perform, but after a great 1965 season, he got injured again, and then the Giants traded for Fran Tarkenton, so his days were numbered, and he was eventually released. He was now 34, past his prime, right? Well, under Don Shula's leadership, following a season-ending injury to Johnny Unitas in 1968, Morrall rattled off 13 wins, won MVP, led the NFL in touchdown passes, yards per attempt, yards per completion, and passer rating, threw for 2,900 yards, and reached a Super Bowl. That was a long list. The amazing thing was, he had only been on the team for a week before starting his first game. Despite not knowing any plays, they won, and they continued to win for the whole season. But such a great year ended horribly in Super Bowl III. Morrall threw 3 interceptions as Joe Namath pulled off the greatest upset in Super Bowl history. The worst moment came when he missed a wide open receiver. A flea flicker tricked the Jets, allowing Jimmy Orr to get wide open near the end zone. But Morrall wasn't looking. Instead, he threw it straight down the middle, right into the hands of Jets' Jim Hudson. That allowed the Jets to keep their 7-0 lead going into the half. Then, in the 3rd quarter, Johnny Unitas would be subbed in, but it was too late at that point. If Morrall had connected with Jimmy Orr, the upset might have never happened. Despite such an ugly performance, he had a chance to redeem himself a couple years later. In Super Bowl V, down 13-6, Johnny Unitas left the game in the 2nd quarter with a rib injury. Morrall came in and led the Colts to 2 scores in the 4th quarter. Although his stat line wasn't great, it was enough, and the Colts won on a last-second field goal. While the Colts went 7-2 with Morrall as the starter in 1971, his stats were not good, so the Colts ended up releasing him. Now, at 37, he must be done, right? Okay, I'll stop with these obvious rhetorical questions. His old coach, Don Shula, was now with the Dolphins, and he brought Morrall in to back up Bob Greasy. Dolphins teammates would call him Old Man, going as far to get him a rocking chair by his locker. But like fine wine, he got better with age. Case in point, over the last 10 years of his NFL career, he started 38 games. He went 33, 4, and 1. His defining career moment would come in Week 5 after Bob Greasy broke his ankle. Morrall would lead the Dolphins to the first perfect season with 11 straight wins. Now they were led by their dominant ground game and so-called no-name defense, but Morrall was still essential to the perfect season. As receiver Paul Warfield would say, if you lose Tom Brady, if you lose Peyton Manning, how many teams would be able to not only continue to win, but win all of your games? The Dolphins players also voted for the MVP of that undefeated season, and they picked Morrall. The league agreed, as he won the first ever Comeback Player of the Year award, and even came second in the MVP voting. But entering the playoffs, Morrall went 6 of 13 for just 88 yards against the Browns. But that gave Don Shula something to think about. Greasy was now healthy, so in what Don Shula would call the toughest decision of his coaching career, he benched Morrall in favour of Greasy. Morrall had started in the AFC title game against the Steelers, but after throwing for just 51 yards, a touchdown and an interception, Shula felt he had to pull him out. The Dolphins went on to beat the Steelers and win the Super Bowl without Morrall, the man who got them there. Yet, this was the story of Morrall's career. When he played, it was volatile. He'd perform well, then he'd have some bad games, and then injuries. And just like that, they'd pull the plug on the short-lived Morrall experiment, if you want to call it that. He'd also underperform in the big games. But I'm not arguing he's a Hall of Famer. He was still a great quarterback, and his name will forever be connected with some of the greatest moments in NFL history. After the undefeated Dolphins season, Morrall didn't see much more playing time, starting just one game in his final 4 years as a backup, before ultimately retiring. To come off the bench once and lead a team to the Super Bowl is an anomaly. To do it twice, only to find yourself back on the bench on both occasions, well, words can't express such an achievement. Earl Morrall wasn't the best to ever play, but he was still one hell of a quarterback.